The morning sun rose slow and soft over Sundown Ridge, spreading golden light across the desert, like a painter brushing warmth over dust. The town was barely awake. Only the faint clatter of horseshoes, the creak of wooden signs swaying in the wind, and the far-off whistle of an approaching train broke the silence. Along the edge of the tracks where the sand met iron, a girl moved quietly, her skirts brushing the ground as she carried a basket of wildflowers against her chest. Clara Mae had been there since dawn, as she was every day. Her flower cart stood beneath the old station sign, its paint peeling but still proud. She arranged the blooms with care, yellow daisies, purple lupines, red prairie roses, each one chosen from the hills before sunrise. Her hands were small, nimble, stained faintly green from stems and leaves, but they moved with a tenderness that made even the roughest petals seem delicate. She hummed softly as she worked, a tune her mother used to sing when she was little, back before the illness took most of her strength. The melody drifted with the dry wind, mixing with the scent of dust and the coming train smoke. When she finished setting the cart, she straightened her apron and wiped her hands on the hem of her skirt, gazing down the tracks that shimmered with heat. That sound, the distant rumble of iron wheels, was the rhythm of her life. Every train brought stories, faces, and possibilities. Travelers stepping off for water or whiskey, workers riding toward mines, ranchers heading east to sell cattle. She sold flowers to them all. Some bought them for sweethearts, some for apologies, and some, like the lonely drifters, bought them for no reason at all. She never asked. She just smiled and said, "May it brighten your journey," as she tied the flower with a strand of twine. Behind her, the town began to stir. The general store opened its shutters. The saloon doors swung, and old Mrs. Lacey from the bakery waved from across the street, calling, "Morning, Clara girl. Up with the sun again, I see." Clara smiled and waved back. "Morning, Mrs. Lacey. I'll stop by for bread later if there's any left." "You know there always is for you, sweetheart," the woman chuckled. "Though I don't know how you stay so cheery by those noisy trains every day." Clara just laughed lightly. "The trains remind me life's still moving, even if mine stays put." When the train finally arrived, hissing and screeching to a halt, she adjusted her bonnet and stood ready. The conductor shouted for passengers, men unloaded crates, and the platform filled with a brief rush of chaos. Clara's smile never faltered. She offered flowers to travelers, to young couples stepping down hand in hand, to widows carrying too much weight in their eyes. Most passed her by, but a few stopped, charmed by her voice, her warmth, or maybe just her quiet hope. By mid-morning, the heat had settled heavy on the town. Her basket was half empty, her hair sticking to her neck, and the air smelled of steel and sand. She leaned against her cart to rest, watching the horizon shimmer. That's when she saw him. He stepped down from the last carriage like he'd been carved out of the land itself. Tall, lean, his boots caked in dust, his hat pulled low over sunburned skin. He had the quiet way of a man who didn't talk unless he had to, the kind of presence that drew attention without trying. His coat was worn, his eyes shadowed, and something about the way he looked at the town made Clara feel as though he were both searching for something and running from it. He stopped a few paces from her cart. For a moment, neither spoke. The train hissed behind them, sending a puff of smoke between their gazes. Then, without a word, he pointed to a single white daisy on the corner of her cart. Clara blinked, startled. "Just one?" she asked softly. He nodded. She picked the daisy carefully, tied a thin string around the stem, and held it out. "It's my favorite," she said, her voice quiet but kind. "Strongest bloom this morning." He took it gently, dropped a coin into her hand, and looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over desert hills. Then he turned and walked toward the road without another word. Clara stood watching until he disappeared behind the livery barn. Something about the encounter lingered, like the aftertaste of something sweet and strange. When she looked down, she realized she still held the coin. It was warm from his hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur of heat and dust. The train left, the town quieted again, and the shadows grew long. As the sky blazed orange, Clara packed her cart and pushed it homeward, along the narrow path leading to the small house she shared with her mother on the edge of town. Inside, the air was cool, and smelled faintly of lavender and soap. Her mother, Clara Mae, sat in a worn armchair by the window, sewing patches into an old quilt. Her hands trembled as she worked, but her eyes still carried that same soft blue light that Clara loved. "Did you sell many today, sweetheart?" her mother asked, smiling up from her work. "Almost all," Clara said, placing the remaining flowers in a jar on the table. "And I met someone new." "Oh?" Marjorie's eyes twinkled. "A traveler? A ranch hand, maybe. Didn't say much." Clara smiled faintly. "He'd bought a daisy. Just one." Her mother chuckled softly. "Sometimes that's how the best stories begin." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "I doubt it's a story, Mama. He barely looked at me." "Men like that always look," Marjorie said knowingly. "They just don't always let you see it." They talked for a while, their voices mingling with the chirp of crickets outside. When her mother grew tired, Clara helped her to bed, brushed her hair, and tucked her in with care. The house fell quiet again. Clara sat by the window, staring out at the tracks in the distance, where a faint glow of moonlight traced the rails like silver threads through the sand. Something in her chest stirred, a restless, hopeful ache. She thought of the stranger's gray eyes, the way he'd held that daisy, the wordless weight in his silence. She wondered where he was sleeping that night. Under the stars? In the barn? On the train again, bound for somewhere far? When she finally went to bed, she placed a single fresh daisy on her nightstand. "Maybe he'll come back," she whispered to the quiet. "Maybe." The next morning, Clara woke before dawn again. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair, and packed her baskets. The air smelled of dew and sagebrush. She stepped outside as the first train whistle sounded in the distance. By the time she reached the platform, the sun was rising, painting the world gold. To her surprise, he was already there. He stood near the edge of the tracks, hat in hand, watching the horizon. When he turned toward her, his expression softened just enough to make her heart skip. "Morning," she greeted, setting her cart in place. He nodded. "Morning." "You're up early," she said lightly, trying to hide her nervousness. "Didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to stop again," he admitted. His voice was low, roughened by years of dust and silence. "Train's late." She smiled faintly. "Lucky for me, then." He hesitated, then glanced at her flowers. "You got another daisy?" "Always." She handed him one, watching his fingers brush hers as he took it. "You sure you don't want a bunch? They last longer." He looked at the flower for a long time before saying, "Just one's enough." She tilted her head. "You must like daisies." "They don't pretend to be more than they are," he said quietly. "They just grow." Clara smiled, surprised by the answer. "I like that." He placed another coin on her counter, nodded, and walked off toward the same road as before. But this time, before he disappeared, he turned back, just for a second, and their eyes met again. Something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and uncertain but real. When he was gone, Clara realized her hands were trembling. She pressed the coin to her heart and laughed softly to herself. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "He came back." That evening she told her mother again, though she tried to make it sound casual. Marjorie smiled knowingly. "Twice in 2 days? That's not a coincidence, darling. That's a beginning." Clara rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. "You think too much like a storybook." "And you," her mother said gently, "don't think enough like someone who deserves to be loved." Clara fell quiet. The truth was, she'd never imagined love for herself. Her world was small. A wooden cart, a dusty track, a little house filled with the sound of wheezing breath and sewing needles. She'd seen girls fall in love and leave town, only to come back with broken hearts. She wasn't sure she wanted to hope. But that night she caught herself looking out the window again, waiting for a whistle that never came. Days passed. He didn't return. She told herself it didn't matter. But every time a train pulled in, her heart lifted, then sank when he wasn't there. Still, she kept setting a daisy aside each morning, just in case. Then 1 week later, he came again. She saw him before he saw her, walking with his hat in hand, a faint smile touching his lips. Something in him looked softer this time, less guarded. When he reached her cart, he picked up a daisy before she could offer it. "Morning, flower girl," he said, voice low but gentler than before. Clara's breath caught at the name. "Morning, mister. You never told me your name." He hesitated, then said, Eli Turner." "Clara Mae," she replied, smiling. "Now we're even." He nodded, his gray eyes catching the light. "Clara Mae," he repeated softly, as if testing the sound. Then he placed the daisy behind his ear with a faint smirk that made her laugh out loud. They talked longer this time, about the weather, the desert, the trains. He told her he worked at a ranch up north, just passing through to sell horses. She told him about her flowers, how some days she thought the whole town forgot they could still grow in the dust. When he finally left, the platform felt emptier than before. That night, Clara placed another daisy beside her bed, next to the first one that had already wilted. She looked at it and smiled. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Maybe he'll come again." And for the first time in a long while, she fell asleep, dreaming not of trains leaving, but of someone returning. The days in Sundown Ridge began to roll together like the steady turning of train wheels, slow, predictable, and always a little too quiet. Yet since the morning Eli Turner first spoke her name, Clara Mae felt the world had changed its rhythm. Every sunrise seemed brighter. Every gust of desert wind carried a different kind of hush, one filled with the possibility that she might see him again. He did come back. Not every day, but often enough that she began to count the hours between his visits. Sometimes he arrived before the noon train, other times just after the evening one. Each time, he bought a single daisy. Each time, he spoke a little more. The people at the station started to notice. Mrs. Lacey from the bakery teased her one morning as she handed over a loaf of fresh bread. "That ranch hand's got you smiling wider than the sunrise, Clara Mae. Don't think I don't see it." Clara blushed and looked down. "He's just a customer, Mrs. Lacey." "Uh-huh," the woman said with a grin. "And I bake bread for the breeze, do I?" Clara laughed, shaking her head. But the truth warmed her. She didn't dare call it love. Not yet. But there was something about the way Eli looked at her when the world around them was all noise and dust. It was like he saw her in perfect stillness, and no one had ever done that before. Every meeting was small, ordinary, but together they built something unspoken. When Eli came, she felt less like the girl tied to a cart by the tracks and more like someone the world had chosen to notice. He told her pieces of his story in fragments, how he worked ranches from Kansas to Arizona, never staying too long, how his father died young, his mother gone since he was a boy, how silence had always been his company until he heard her voice that first morning. "You talk like sunshine," he said once quietly, "even when you don't say much." Clara had looked up from her flowers, caught off guard. "And you listen like it matters," she replied. He smiled then, a small, crooked thing that looked unused but honest. It became her favorite sight. Sometimes, when the trains passed, their conversations would pause. The roar would drown out every word, yet they'd stay there, eyes locked, as petals lifted from her cart and swirled through the wind. After each train left, there was always a stillness between them, a kind of shared breath that neither tried to name. In the evenings, after her work, Clara would walk home replaying their talks in her head. Her mother began to notice the way she hummed while cooking, the way her cheeks stayed pink even after sundown. "Someone's making you smile, I see," Marjorie teased softly one night while Clara brushed her hair. Clara tried to deflect it. "It's just been a good week, Mama. Sold plenty of flowers." "Sold plenty of smiles too, I imagine," her mother said, chuckling. "You remind me of myself, you know. I once had a cowboy come around like that. Always bought apples. Didn't eat a single one." Clara laughed, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. "And what happened to him?" Her mother's eyes softened. "He became your father." The room filled with quiet. The old clock ticked, and the soft wind moved the curtain. Clara didn't answer, but she thought about it long after her mother fell asleep. A few weeks later, Eli came by on a particularly hot afternoon. The sky shimmered like glass, and most folks had taken shelter from the heat. Clara was about to pack up when she saw him walking toward her from the far end of the street, a slow, steady figure against the glare. "You'll melt out here," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then I'll smell like wildflowers," she joked. "You came later than usual." "Had work to finish," he said. "Didn't want the day to end without seeing you." She froze for half a second, pretending to fuss with a ribbon so he wouldn't see her blush. "Well," she said lightly, "you just made it better." He looked at her cart, then up at the sky. "You got any water?" She handed him a small flask from under the counter. He took a sip, then returned it carefully. "You shouldn't be out here alone all day," he said. "This heat's cruel." "I've had worse," she replied. "Besides, the flowers don't pick themselves." He looked at her hands, small, sun-touched, calloused from the stems, and shook his head. "You deserve more than this, Clara." His voice was rougher than usual, carrying something she couldn't quite read. She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, the train horn echoed across the desert. The ground shook, steam hissed. People began to move, shouting, laughing, hurrying. The moment was gone. He bought his daisy in silence that day. Before leaving, he reached out and brushed a stray petal from her cheek. "Take care of yourself," he murmured. Then he turned and was gone again, leaving her standing there with her heart tumbling like the train wheels fading into distance. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with the moonlight spilling across her lap, replaying his words again and again. "You deserve more than this." What did he mean? Was he warning her? Was he saying goodbye? The next morning she woke before dawn, restless. She picked flowers without her usual calm, her hands trembling when she tied the stems. She reached the station earlier than ever. Hours passed. No Eli. The trains came and went, faces blurred by dust and steam. Still, she waited. By midday, disappointment sat heavy in her chest. She told herself not to be foolish. He was a traveler, after all. Men like him drifted through life like tumbleweeds, belonging nowhere, staying nowhere. And yet, when she packed up her cart, her eyes still searched the horizon. He returned 2 days later. When she saw him, relief flooded her so suddenly she nearly dropped her basket. He approached slower this time, almost sheepish, as though he knew she'd been waiting. "You weren't here yesterday," she said, trying to sound casual. "Had to ride out past the ridge. Work," he said. "Did you miss me?" Her lips parted, caught between honesty and modesty. "A little." His smile was quiet but real. "Good." They stood there a while, saying nothing. He picked up a daisy, but instead of paying, he tucked it into her hair just above her ear. "Now you're the one carrying flowers," he said. She laughed softly. "That's cheating." "Call it repayment," he replied. That became their rhythm. Every time he came, he found a new way to make her laugh. A crooked compliment, a story from the ranch, a gift of smooth stones from the river. He never stayed long, but his presence filled the hours after he left. The whispers in town grew louder. Some folks teased, others warned her to be careful. "Cowboys leave," the blacksmith said one afternoon. "That's what they do." Clara smiled politely, but inside, she clung to hope. She'd seen the way Eli looked at her, the way he lingered, even after saying goodbye. That wasn't a man looking to leave. That was a man afraid to stay. One evening, when the sun was bleeding orange across the sand, Eli came to her just as she was closing her cart. "Ride with me," he said suddenly. "Just down the ridge and back." Clara hesitated. "I can't. My mother, just for a few minutes. She'll still be there when you get home." The way he said it, quiet and sure, melted her hesitation. She climbed onto his horse, and they rode out past the last fence of town, into the open prairie. The wind caught her hair, the world stretched wide, and for the first time, she felt what freedom really meant. When they stopped near a small stream, Eli dismounted and helped her down. The water glimmered like silver under the sunset. They sat together on the bank, neither speaking for a long time. "She used to sing here," he said finally. "My mother. Before we moved west, said water remembers the voices of the ones who love it." "That's beautiful," Clara said softly. "Do you believe it?" He looked at her, the light catching in his gray eyes. "I'm starting to believe a lot of things again." Her breath caught. The silence that followed was heavy but sweet. The wind moved through the grass, the sky turned violet, and the world seemed to hold its breath. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. His touch was warm, careful, like he was afraid she might vanish if he held too tight. They stayed there until the stars appeared. Then he rode her home, stopping just beyond the station where the lights of town began. She slid off the horse, her skirt brushing the ground. "Thank you," she whispered, "for tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you for the flowers." Then he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was barely a touch, a whisper of warmth, but it left her trembling. After he rode off, Clara stood there under the starlight, her heart full of something vast and aching. She didn't know if it was love, but she knew she never wanted it to end. In the days that followed, Eli kept coming. Sometimes he'd stay long enough to help her carry the cart back home. Other times he'd fix the wheel or chase away rowdy boys who teased her. He became part of her days the way sunrise was part of morning, quiet, dependable, and brighter than she realized. But beneath her happiness lingered fear. Her mother's cough had worsened. The doctor's visits grew more frequent, the medicines more expensive. Some nights, Clara stayed up counting coins by lamplight, worrying she wouldn't have enough to keep the house. She never told Eli. He had his own burdens. She could see it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the weight of roads behind him, the ghosts he never spoke of. One afternoon, as he helped her close the cart, he caught her staring at the horizon. "What's out there?" he asked. "Everything," she said, "and nothing. I just want to see what the world looks like beyond these tracks." "You will," he said, "someday." "Maybe," she whispered, "if I ever get free." He touched her cheek gently. "You already are, Clara Mae. You just don't see it yet." That night, she wrote his name on a slip of paper and tucked it beneath her pillow. The next morning, she woke to the sound of thunder. Not from the sky, but from the train rolling in late and loud. She rushed to the station, heart racing. But Eli wasn't there. She waited all day, no sign, no word. The daisies wilted in the heat. When she finally packed up her cart, the sky turned gray, and the wind carried the first chill of the coming storm. She stood by the tracks until the last light faded, her hands wrapped around the last daisy of the day. "Come back," she whispered to the empty rails. "Please." But the only answer was the sound of the wind through the wires, singing like distant memory. She turned toward home, clutching the flower close, unaware that the next time she returned, everything she knew was about to change forever. The storm came without warning. All morning the wind had been restless, tumbling dust across the town, bending the wildflowers that lined the tracks until their petals broke. By afternoon the sky turned the color of pewter, heavy with a silence that pressed against the heart. Eli arrived late that day, his coat soaked, his boots dragging mud as he walked toward the empty platform. He could already tell something was wrong before he reached her cart. Clara wasn't there. Her little wooden stand stood half covered with a tarp, its corners snapping in the wind. A few daisies lay scattered across the ground, their stems broken, their color fading fast. The space she had always filled, with her soft laughter, her gentle words, her quiet steadiness, felt like a hole carved in the air. Eli stopped, staring at it for a long moment, unwilling to believe. He asked around the station first. The conductor shook his head. "Ain't seen her since yesterday. Girl probably went home early. Bad weather comin'." He nodded, though doubt twisted inside him. Clara never left before the last train. She once told him she liked to watch it leave, just to imagine where it was going. He waited. Through one train, then another. The sky cracked open and rain began to fall hard, soaking the earth, filling the air with the smell of dust and iron. Still, she didn't come. He stood there until the platform was empty and the lamps flickered to life. When he finally left, the station was a ghost, and the storm was roaring like a living thing. By the time he reached her small cottage on the edge of town, the night had swallowed the road. The windows glowed faintly through the rain, so he knocked, hoping she'd answer with that soft voice of hers. But the door opened to stillness. Inside, everything was bare. The table where her mother's sewing basket once sat was empty. The vase that always held her leftover flowers was gone. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, but no warmth lingered. He stepped inside, calling her name once, twice. His voice echoed back at him. On the windowsill lay a single daisy, the petals slightly wilted, a scrap of paper beneath it. "Thank you for seeing me." That was all it said. No signature, no explanation. He read it again, the words blurring as the rain dripped from his hat onto the paper. His hands trembled. She was gone, just gone, like the wind that took the petals from her cart each afternoon. Eli sank into the chair by the cold fireplace. The room was quiet, but not peaceful. Too quiet, like the pause between lightning and thunder. He ran his thumb over the note until it nearly tore, then folded it and placed it in his pocket. He didn't know where she'd gone, or why, but he knew he couldn't stay still. He spent the next morning asking everyone. Mrs. Lacey said she hadn't seen her since 2 days before the storm. The doctor said her mother's cough had worsened and then stopped asking for visits. The preacher at the small chapel told him she'd come by last week to pray, quiet and alone. No one knew where she went. Some said she might have taken a train east. Others whispered she owed money and ran off to work in a city. A few said she'd gone to the coast, chasing some dream of a flower shop by the sea. Eli didn't believe any of them. Clara wasn't the kind to run. She was the kind to endure. He kept visiting the tracks anyway, every day for weeks. He'd stand by her empty cart buying flowers from the boy who'd taken her place. The kid didn't ask why a grown man kept paying for daisies only to leave them by the rails. Eli didn't have an answer to give. He just knew it felt wrong to walk away with empty hands. The townsfolk started calling him the man who buys ghosts. He ignored them. At night, he stayed in the small room above the saloon, lying awake, listening to the trains. Each whistle felt like a heartbeat from another life. He'd close his eyes and see her, smiling, hair caught in the wind, sunlight on her face. Then he'd wake, reach for the space beside him, and feel nothing but cold air. Winter came. The flowers stopped blooming. The tracks froze in the mornings, glinting like ribbons of glass. Eli's visits grew less frequent, not because he forgot, but because the emptiness began to hurt too much. He started working longer hours at the ranch north of town, fixing fences, breaking horses, doing anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from drifting. But no matter how hard he worked, she followed him. In the smell of rain, in the color of the sky at dusk, in the silence that lingered just before dawn. Once, while mending a broken gate, he found himself talking to her out loud. "You didn't even let me say goodbye." His voice cracked against the open land. "Did you think I wouldn't follow?" The wind answered with a soft whistle through the grass, like the hum she used to make when arranging flowers. He dropped his tools, pressing his palms to his face. "I would have gone anywhere with you," he whispered. He didn't cry then, not fully. The tears came later, quietly, while he rode back to town under the cold starlight. Months passed. The seasons changed. Sundown Ridge stayed the same. Dust, rails, trains, and endless sky. But for Eli, the world felt smaller now. The things that once gave him comfort, the sound of hooves, the smell of smoke, the laughter from the saloon, now only reminded him of her absence. One evening, near the end of winter, he sat alone by the station again. The platform was empty, the last train long gone. In his hand was a single dried daisy, pressed between the pages of his notebook. He had carried it everywhere since the day she left. The petals were brittle, but somehow it still held its shape. He looked at it for a long time before speaking softly to the air. "If I ever find you, Clara Mae, I'm not letting you vanish again, not without knowing why." The lamplight flickered in the wind, and for a moment he thought he saw her. Just a shape, standing near the edge of the tracks. A trick of shadow and memory. He blinked, and she was gone. Spring arrived, and with it, the first blooms along the hills. The air turned warm again, the kind of warmth that made him ache. He began hearing rumors of a new flower shop opening in a nearby town. Willowbend, a place small but growing fast. 2 days, ride north. The thought made his heart thump, though he told himself not to hope. There were 100 flower sellers between here and the coast. It couldn't be her. Still, he found himself asking travelers if they'd heard the name Clara Mae. Some said no. One woman said maybe. A man from Willow Bend swore there was a girl there who looked like she belonged in a painting, always wearing a daisy behind her ear. That was enough. Eli packed what little he owned, the notebook, the pressed flower, the worn hat she once said made him look too serious, and set out before sunrise. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just left, following the rails north, as if the tracks themselves might lead him to her. He rode through long stretches of prairie and desert, through rain and silence. At night, he camped by the rails, staring at the stars until they blurred. Each morning, he'd wake with the same promise in his chest: find her. On the 5th day, he reached Willow Bend. The town was smaller than Sundown Ridge, but livelier, full of sound and color. Children ran through the streets, horses clopped over cobblestone, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with something sweeter: flowers. He followed the scent through the square, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it over the noise. Then he saw it, a small shop tucked between the tailor and the post office. A painted sign above the door read in neat, careful letters, "Clara's Blossoms. Flowers for every journey." His breath caught. For a moment, he couldn't move. Through the window, he saw her. She stood behind a counter, arranging tulips in a glass vase, her hair tied back with a ribbon, her hands moving with the same calm grace he remembered. Her dress was new, light blue with white lace along the sleeves. She looked stronger somehow, older perhaps, but her smile, when she turned to hand a bouquet to a customer, was exactly the same. Eli stayed frozen on the street, unable to breathe. Then she looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The world outside seemed to stop. No footsteps, no noise, no air. Then she blinked, her lips parting in shock. The vase slipped from her fingers and shattered against the counter. She didn't even look at it. She pushed open the door, the little bell above it ringing, and stepped out into the sunlight. Eli took a step forward, then another. He wanted to speak, but his throat was dry. She stopped in front of him, tears already in her eyes. "Eli," she whispered. He managed a small, broken smile. "You disappeared." "I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "Mama was dying. I sold everything to take her somewhere peaceful. By the time she was gone, I didn't know how to come back." He reached into his coat and pulled out the old pressed daisy. "I never stopped waiting." She covered her mouth, sobbing softly. "You kept it?" "I kept you," he said. Clara stepped closer, her hand shaking as she touched his face. The warmth of her fingers felt like sunlight after endless winter. "I thought you'd forgotten." "I tried," he admitted. "Didn't work." They stood there, silent, tears mixing with laughter. Around them, people passed by, but the world had narrowed to just the two of them. She smiled through her tears. "You came all this way for a flower seller." He shook his head. "No, for the only thing that ever made me stay." She pressed her forehead to his, her voice breaking. "Don't ever make me say goodbye again." He smiled, closing his eyes. "Then don't ever vanish." The bell above her shop door rang softly in the breeze. The scent of flowers filled the air: roses, tulips, daisies. Clara reached behind him, plucked a fresh daisy from the basket near the window, and tucked it into his hand. "This one's not for sale," she whispered. "This one's forever." He pulled her close, and the town around them blurred into color and light. The train whistled faintly in the distance, but neither looked away. For the first time since Sundown Ridge, Eli Turner smiled without pain. The girl by the tracks had vanished, yes, but only to bloom again, stronger than before. And as the sunlight wrapped around them, he finally understood. He had never been chasing a ghost. He had been chasing home. The days that followed their reunion felt like living inside a dream that neither of them dared to wake from. The world that had once been gray and restless for Eli began to glow again with purpose, as though each sunrise was painted by Clara's hand. He found himself standing in front of her shop each morning just to watch her open the door. She would sweep the porch, arrange the new blooms brought from nearby farms, and always, when she noticed him across the street, she'd smile as if no time at all had passed between them. Clara's blossoms quickly became the heart of Willow Bend. The townsfolk stopped by, Not only for flowers, but for her kindness, her laughter, and the gentle way she wrapped hope into every bouquet. She told each customer the meaning of every stem: daisies for honesty, roses for remembrance, lilies for new beginnings. Eli often lingered by the doorway, pretending to read the newspaper while he watched her work. The sound of her voice, the soft rustle of paper wrapping flowers, became the music of his days. He had rented a small cabin just beyond town, close enough that he could hear the trains at night, far enough that he could see the stars without city lamps drowning them. Sometimes Clara visited after closing her shop, walking the dirt path with a basket of leftover flowers. She'd find him sitting on the porch, boots kicked off, whittling wood into little shapes: birds, horses, sometimes hearts. She teased him for it, but he noticed she kept each one. One evening, the sunset spread over the sky in waves of rose and amber. Clara arrived later than usual, her hair loose from its ribbon, her cheeks flushed from hurrying. "Sorry," she said, breathless. "Had a customer who wanted half the shop." "A wedding tomorrow." Eli smiled and reached for her hand. "You're building the town one flower at a time." "Maybe," she said, sitting beside him. "But I couldn't do any of this before. Not until—" She paused, looking at him, eyes bright with something unspoken. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Until what?" "Until I believed I was allowed to be happy," she said softly. "For so long, I thought it was something that belonged to other people." Eli squeezed her hand gently. "You were always allowed, Clara Mae. You just needed someone to remind you." She smiled, tears glinting in the fading light. "Then don't stop reminding me." They sat quietly, watching the stars bloom one by one across the sky. The train's whistle echoed faintly in the distance, and for a brief moment they both looked toward the sound, remembering the long ache of the months they had lost. Then Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and the memory softened into something beautiful instead of painful. He kissed the top of her head. "You still hear it, don't you? The sound of the tracks?" "I do," she whispered, "but it doesn't sound lonely anymore." Her words settled deep in him like roots. That night, as he walked her home, the air smelled of jasmine and warm dust, and he realized that the quiet between them no longer hurt. It hummed with peace. Weeks turned into months. Their lives began to weave together in small, tender ways. She taught him the language of flowers, and he taught her how to ride a horse again. She laughed the first few times she tried, clutching his arm for balance, accusing him of letting the horse trot too fast. He'd laugh back, pretending innocence. When she finally managed to ride alone across the field, her hair flying wild and her laughter echoing through the hills, he thought she had never looked freer. They spent their Sundays walking by the river that bordered Willow Bend. Clara collected smooth stones to decorate her shop window. Eli carved initials into one of the trees near the water. Nothing fancy, just their letters and the date they found each other again. He told her it would outlast both of them, and she teased that he was too sentimental for a ranch hand. But some nights, when the moon rose high and the world fell quiet, Clara still woke with tears on her face. Dreams of her mother came back, soft and sad, reminding her of what she'd lost and how far she'd come. On those nights, Eli would hold her close without words. She'd press her ear against his chest, listening to his heartbeat until the ache eased. He had been alone for so long that loving her felt like learning how to breathe again. Sometimes he still woke, expecting the silence of the desert, only to find her beside him, hair spilling across the pillow, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He'd watch her sleep until the morning light brushed across her face, and he'd think there was no language in the world that could describe what he felt. Clara's shop thrived. Travelers began to make detours just to see it. A newspaper from the city even printed a small piece calling it a haven of beauty at the edge of the frontier. Eli built her new shelves, a wooden counter, and a little signpost for the road that simply read "Flowers Ahead." She kissed him for that, quick, bright, full of gratitude, and he spent the rest of the day walking around with a grin that made every ranch hand on the road tease him mercilessly. One late afternoon, a heavy storm rolled in. Clara rushed to close the shop, her hands fumbling as thunder shook the windows. Eli arrived just in time to help her lock the shutters. Rain began to fall in hard sheets, drumming against the roof. Inside, they sat together on the floor among the scent of lilies and damp earth, candlelight flickering over their faces. "Do you remember the last storm?" she asked quietly. "How could I forget?" he said. "That was the day you disappeared." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I never wanted to, but Mama was dying fast. I didn't know how to stay and watch her go, not in that town. She wanted to see the ocean. I sold the house, the cart, everything. Took her east. We made it just in time." He listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing slow circles over her wrist. "She passed a week later," Clara whispered, "peacefully, by the water. She told me to keep selling flowers no matter where I ended up. Said as long as I could make something bloom, I'd never be alone." Eli's chest tightened. "She was right. I wanted to write you," Clara continued, voice trembling. "But I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. I thought maybe you'd found someone else, or left, or stopped buying daisies altogether." He smiled faintly. "I never stopped. Still have one pressed in my notebook." She looked up, eyes glistening. "Show me." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the old, fragile page. The daisy had lost its color long ago, but its shape was perfect. She touched it like something sacred. "You carried this all this time?" "Every day," he said simply. She looked at him then, really looked, and the storm outside faded into a distant hum. "I love you," she said softly, the words trembling like petals. He breathed out slowly, his voice rough. "I love you too, Clara Mae. Always have." Their lips met in the candlelight, gentle at first, then deeper, full of everything they'd lost and found again. The rain beat harder against the roof, but inside, the world was warm and quiet. When the storm passed, dawn came soft and gold. They stepped outside to find the whole town washed clean, the air smelling fresh, the flowers glistening like jewels. Clara took his hand, leading him to the small garden behind her shop. The soil was dark and rich from the rain. She knelt down and began to dig, her fingers steady. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Planting roots," she said. "For us." He knelt beside her, pressing his hand over hers. Together they buried the daisy she had touched, the one he'd carried all that time. The moment felt quiet, sacred, a promise sown into the earth. Days later, the first tiny sprout broke through the soil. She smiled when she saw it, and Eli swore he'd never seen anything more beautiful. As spring turned to summer, Willow Bend bloomed around them. Children played near the river, trains came and went, and Clara's shop became a landmark travelers sought just to say they'd seen it. She'd greet them with her bright smile, always offering a flower for the road. Sometimes Eli helped, carrying crates, trimming stems, pretending to complain while secretly loving every second beside her. They still visited the ridge sometimes, the place where their story began. The tracks shimmered under the same sun, the wind carrying the same old tune. Clara would stand there, eyes closed, listening to the trains pass, her hair whipping around her face. "Feels different now," she said once. "How so?" "It used to sound like leaving," she said. "Now it sounds like life moving forward." Eli watched her, the woman who once sold flowers to strangers by the tracks, who had taught him how to hope again. "Then we keep moving with it," he said. She turned to him, smiling. "Together?" "Always." He kissed her then, as a train thundered by, scattering petals into the air. They laughed as the wind wrapped around them, the scent of daisies filling the air, and for a moment the world seemed to spin slower, holding its breath for them. Two souls who had found their way back to where they were always meant to be. That night back at the cabin, Eli lit a lamp and began to carve again. Clara sat beside him, humming softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "What are you making now?" she asked. He smiled, the wood shavings curling at his feet. "A frame." "For what?" He lifted the finished carving, a simple wooden frame with a heart and a daisy etched at its corner. Inside, he placed the little note she had left behind in Sundown Ridge. "Thank you for seeing me." Clara stared at it, tears filling her eyes. "You kept that too?" "I kept everything that reminded me I wasn't dreaming," he said. She kissed him, slow and sure. "Then keep this, too," she whispered, and she placed her hand over his heart. Outside, the train passed through the night, its whistle carrying softly across the valley. But this time, it didn't sound lonely at all. It sounded like home. The seasons rolled by gently in Willowbend, the way years do when life has finally found its rhythm. The world outside kept changing. Trains came faster now. New people arrived with strange ideas and brighter clothes. But inside the little flower shop, time moved softly, like petals falling on sunlight. Clara Mae woke each morning to the scent of blooms and the warmth of Eli's arms. The quiet peace of it still startled her sometimes. After all the years of dust, sorrow, and distance, happiness felt almost fragile, like something borrowed from heaven. The mornings were her favorite. She'd rise before dawn, tying her hair back while Eli stirred the fire for coffee. The first light would paint the wooden floor golden, and she'd hum while trimming flowers, the soft snip of the scissors keeping time with the birds outside. Sometimes he'd pause just to watch her in that light. The glow of it, touching her skin, the rhythm of her small movements filling the cabin with calm. She always noticed and teased him for staring, but she loved it secretly. To be seen by him, fully, gently, was something she'd never grow used to. When the shop opened, Willowbend came alive. Travelers stopped by for bouquets. Children ran in to steal petals and laughter, and old men rested by the porch to smell the air thick with jasmine and soil. Clara knew them all by name. She had grown roots here, real, deep ones. Yet each time she heard the distant whistle of a train, her chest still fluttered. It wasn't fear anymore. It was memory, gratitude for the road that had once carried her away only to bring her home again. Eli spent most days working at the small ranch east of town. He liked the quiet labor, the honesty of it. His hands, once rough from endless wandering, were steady now, strong but gentle. When he came home in the evenings, dust in his hair, she'd meet him at the gate with a glass of water and a kiss. They didn't need grand words. The way they looked at each other said everything that ever mattered. Sometimes they'd close the shop early and ride out together past the fields where the wind moved through the grass in waves. They'd sit beneath the willow tree by the river, the same one where they had carved their initials years before, and talk about dreams that didn't scare them anymore. Clara wanted to teach other girls to grow flowers, maybe even open a second shop one day. Eli wanted to build her a greenhouse with windows so wide the stars could look in. She laughed at that, saying he made promises too big for the sky. He just smiled, saying the sky would learn to make room. On Sundays, they visited the cemetery where her mother rested, far beyond the hill. Clara always brought white lilies, her mother's favorite, and knelt by the grave, brushing leaves from the stone. Eli would stand nearby, hat in hand, silent but present. She would talk softly, telling her mother about the shop, about Eli, about the daisy patch that now grew behind their home. "You were right," she'd whisper. "I'm not alone." When they walked back down the hill, Eli would take her hand without speaking, and that was enough. One summer, a drought swept through the valley. The flowers wilted, the river thinned, and the soil cracked under the sun. Clara tried to save what she could, watering at dawn, shading the most fragile blooms, but it felt like trying to hold the desert back with her bare hands. The people in town came by less, their money tight, their spirits lower. Eli saw the worry in her eyes and began bringing home extra pay, sometimes trading his labor for sacks of water instead of coin. He told her it would pass, but she could see the strain in his shoulders, the fatigue in his hands. One evening, after closing the shop early, she found him sitting on the porch, staring at the dying fields. "You shouldn't work so hard," she said softly. "We'll manage." He didn't look up. "I just don't want to see you lose this again." Clara sat beside him, resting her head against his arm. "Even if every flower dies, I still have what I needed most." He turned then, meeting her eyes. "And what's that?" "You," she said simply. "You're the one thing that never withers." He smiled faintly, but there was sorrow in it. "You always know how to make me believe the world isn't cruel." "That's because it isn't," she whispered. "Not all the time. Sometimes it gives us back what we thought we'd lost forever." That night, rain finally came. It started as a whisper on the roof, then grew into a steady rhythm. Clara ran outside barefoot, laughing as the drops soaked her hair. Eli followed. pulling her close as the storm washed over them. They danced in the rain like children, their laughter mingling with the sound of thunder. The next morning, the earth smelled alive again. New shoots pushed through the soil, small and brave, and Clara swore she could almost hear them breathing. The drought ended, and life bloomed twice as strong. Travelers returned, business grew, and one morning a newspaper arrived at the shop addressed to her. Inside was an article about the flower woman of Willow Bend, whose garden had survived the worst summer the town had seen in years. The writer called her the lady who turned dust into beauty. Eli framed the clipping and hung it above her counter. She rolled her eyes but kept smiling every time she saw it. As autumn came, the air turned cool and sharp. The leaves along the river burned gold and red, and the sky deepened into sapphire blue. Clara began hosting small gatherings in her shop, teaching children how to plant seeds, sharing tea with older women who came just to talk. Eli built benches outside so folks could sit beneath the sign that now read flowers for every journey and for every heart. He'd watch from across the street sometimes, proud and quiet, knowing this place had become exactly what she'd dreamed of when she was the lonely girl by the tracks. But one evening, as the last train roared by and the lamps flickered on, Clara stood by the window longer than usual. The sound of the wheels fading into distance stirred something old inside her. Eli came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Thinking of Sundown Ridge again?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "It's strange. I used to stand by those tracks wishing for a way out. Now, I stand here wishing I could tell that girl everything she needed to know." "What would you tell her?" he asked softly. "That it's okay to wait," she said. "That sometimes love doesn't come fast or loud. Sometimes it just grows, like a seed that takes its time." Eli kissed her temple. Then she'd be proud of who she became. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I think she'd be even prouder of who she found." They stayed like that until the lamps dimmed and the stars rose over the shop. The night was quiet, save for the distant sound of the train calling across the valley, a sound that once meant goodbye but now felt like a promise of forever. Years drifted by like petals on water. The shop expanded, the garden flourished, and the cabin became a home filled with laughter and the scent of earth. Eli's hair turned silver at the edges, and Clara's hands grew softer, slower, but her eyes still carried that same steady light. They never had children of their own, but the town's children filled their lives. They called her Miss Clara and him Mr. Eli, bringing flowers and stories every weekend. One evening, when the sun sank low and the air shimmered with gold, Clara asked Eli to walk with her to the tracks outside town. The old rails still gleamed under the fading light, stretching far into the horizon. She held his hand tightly, her touch delicate but sure. "It's been so long," she murmured. "Do you remember the first day you bought a daisy?" "I remember everything," he said. "You looked at me like you saw through every mile I'd ever walked." "I did," she said, "and I loved every mile that led you to me." The wind swept through the grass, carrying the faint sound of a coming train. Clara stepped closer to the rails, watching the glimmer of metal under the sunset. "This was where everything started," she whispered. "Every flower, every choice, every hope." Eli's eyes softened. "And where it all came back." When the train appeared in the distance, its whistle echoing through the valley, she turned to him with tears glistening in her eyes, not of sorrow, but gratitude. "Do you think people like us get to last forever?" she asked. He smiled. "We already have. Every flower that grows, every person who walks through that shop, they carry a piece of us. That's forever enough for me." She rested her head against his chest as the train thundered past, the wind lifting her hair, the petals from her basket scattering into the air like tiny stars. For a heartbeat, the world around them disappeared, leaving only the pulse of the rails, the warmth of his arms, and the soft scent of daisies between them. When the train was gone, silence settled again. Clara lifted her face, smiling through the fading light. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" she asked. He chuckled softly. "That one daisy was enough," she nodded. "And it was. Because it brought you back to me." They walked home slowly, the dusk folding around them like a tender curtain. The lamps of Willow Bend flickered ahead, and the sound of laughter drifted from the shop porch. The world felt full, alive, infinite. And for the first time in either of their lives, there was no fear of what came next, only peace. Later that night, after dinner, they sat together on the porch as they always did. The stars spread wide above them, the moon bright and kind. Clara leaned into Eli's shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "You know what's funny? For so long I thought love was something you found once. But it isn't. It's something you keep finding. Every day you wake up beside the right person." Eli smiled, his hand finding hers. "Then I hope I keep finding you for the rest of my days." She turned her head, eyes shining. "You already have." A soft breeze passed, stirring the flowers that grew along the porch rail. Daisies, blooming in every color she had ever dreamed of. Their petals brushed against one another gently, as if whispering secrets to the night. The train whistled again in the distance, low and steady. Eli tightened his hold around her, the rhythm of it blending with the sound of her breath. And when morning came, it painted the sky in the same golden hues as the day they first met. The shop bell rang, the streets filled with life. The world kept turning, as it always had. But for those who passed by Clara's blossoms, there was always something in the air, something tender, unseen, like the echo of laughter and the memory of love that never left. By the tracks outside town, wild daisies grew in a perfect line, swaying with the wind. No one remembered who had planted them, but every bloom leaned slightly toward the rails, as if waiting for someone who would always return. And beneath the soft whisper of the trains, if you listened closely, you could still almost hear it. Her voice, gentle as sunlight. "May it brighten your journey." In the end, love was never about the flowers she sold or the miles he traveled. It was about two hearts that kept finding their way back, through storms, through silence, through time itself. And even when the trains moved on and the petals fell, their love remained, rooted in the soil of memory, blooming forever by the tracks. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale blooms from the dust of the frontier into unforgettable love. Saddle up and stay tuned, because the next story might just steal your heart all over again.